Hello and welcome back. Um, we ended up uh, last session talking about the general overall structure of um, financial departments. And now we're going to talk about how finance, the kinds of things finance has to look at, the way we measure financial success. And this will tie into your case study that you're going to have to do for this week as well. So financial management ratios. How do we know if we're doing a good job at financial management? Essentially is what these ratios tell us. They also provide us the ability to compare my performance with somebody else's performance. So think about this in terms of the case study you're going to do. You're going to compare peasant number one and peasant number two. I think their names are Pierre and Jules. You're going to compare them and try to tell the baron who did a better job, who was more successful at their farming. Since they have different resources, the results of their gross profit and gross results are going to be different. But if we put them into ratios, we may be able to determine who did a better job given what their inputs were. So some of the ratios that you use to determine those things are return on investment. So how much money did I invest in a particular project? And what did I get back? If I invested $10 million and I got $1 million back, then I have each year, then I have a 10% annual return on investment. Return on equity. Equity is a portion of the balance sheet. It's the amount that outsiders have committed as capital to a company. So return on equity tells me how much I return based on the amount that I have physically put in. So return on investment, I'm going to buy a new ship for $10 million. My investment is $10 million. But maybe I only provided $1 million of that capital and the other $9 million was borrowed. $1 million of capital I provided is my equity. So in that case, if I provided $1 million in equity and my return was $1 million, then I have 100% return on equity, while only a 10% return on investment. Another measure on a balance sheet, we look at all the assets and say, what's my return on all my assets, my invested assets? And then return on net assets, that's assets minus liabilities. What's the return that I'm getting on my assets minus the related liabilities? So different measures, and there's a bunch of other ones as well. We'll get into these in more depth later in the course, but this is the way we measure how we're doing. So why do we need to measure? Well, we want to know how we're doing. Are we winning or losing? Are we doing a better job than someone else? Is there some way we can improve and do a better job ourselves? So financial managers have two primary goals. They are trying to maximize profitability, which we talked about earlier, but they also want to survive or be viable. So we need to have viability as well as profitability. And those two things are often in conflict. They often are, profitability often may be achievable only at the expense of reducing our viability or our survivability. So if we have to take a lot of risk to make a profit, then we're taking risk, and taking risk means that we have the potential for maybe reducing viability. So there's always a balance between return, profit, and risk. If I'm taking a large risk, is the return great enough to justify taking that risk? So if I invest in a new ship, I've done my projections and the potential for return is quite large. Great, I have a potential to do quite well. But what is the downside? What if my projections are not accurate? What are the chances that my projections will be wrong? And then what's the upshot of those projections being wrong? So in the currently in the oil industry, a lot of people spend a lot of money building drill ships. to exploit deep sea oil. Those drill ships are now either operating at less than capacity or not operating at all. So if I built a drill ship, spent $100 million on a drill ship, expecting that I could lease it out for $500,000 a day, and now it's sitting in, it's laid up, it's not generating any income. I still have that $100 million investment, and that's enough to sink companies and has sunk companies. So some companies have gone bankrupt because they had taken a risk and it turned for a large return, and the return didn't materialize and the risk came back and bit them. So we're always trading those off. So we're trading off risk versus return. Any investment or any business venture has a trade-off of risk versus return, and we have to balance those. We would like to get the highest return possible, but we want to minimize our risk. So what's our risk tolerance? How much can we afford to risk? And if we take a large risk, are we risking the survivability of our organization? And these things apply to profit-making companies. They apply to nonprofits as well. Nonprofits have to take risks too. They build a new building. College adds a new campus, adds new majors, and they don't work. If they work, it's good. If they don't work, it might drag the whole university or the whole institution down. So lots of different things going on there. So viability is about survival. Can I stay in business? Can I continue to operate? Can I continue to do whatever it is that I do? And we use a couple of different ways to measure that. We measure viability in terms of liquidity and in terms of solvency. Liquidity measures short-term viability, and solvency measures long-term viability. And in accounting and finance, short-term is 1 year or less by definition. That's called current or short-term, and long-term is more than 1 year. So we always use that 1 year cutoff in accounting and finance between short-term and long-term. So liquidity measures the resources that we have that are in cash or near cash compared to what we're going to have to pay in the near term. So our current assets, our assets that are going to turn into cash within a year, against our current liabilities, things that we're going to have to pay within a year. If we're liquid, we're viable in the near term or within 12 months. We have 12 months of viability. So that's liquidity. Solvency is long-term. So solvency is the same concept, but we're looking at long-term viability, more than 1 year. So you say, how could we be liquid and not viable? Or liquid and not solvent, liquid and not solvent, or solvent and not liquid. We can be either of those things. So we could have a lot of cash right now, $50 million. We could have short-term obligations or 1 year obligations that we predict to be $10 million. So we're very liquid. We have 5 times as much cash as we expect to owe in the next 12 months. However, next year, we have a bond issue coming due for $100 million. So we borrowed $100 million sometime in the past, and we have to pay it back next year. Oh, well, we're very liquid, and we're not very solvent. Where's the money going to come from to pay the bondholders the $100 million that we're required to pay them next year? There's a situation, very liquid, not very solvent. The flip side of that is I may have lots of long-term assets, but very little free cash. So I have lots of ships and lots of warehouses and lots of terminals, all of which have value, but they're all long-term assets. They don't turn into cash very easily. I can't convert them to cash. and yet I owe a lot of cash right now. So I'm not liquid. I'm very solvent. I have lots of assets, not too many liabilities, but I have current liabilities. I have stuff I owe right now, and I don't have the cash to pay my current liabilities. So solvency and liquidity are not the same thing. They're related, but they're not the same thing. And what you're really looking for in financial structure is both liquidity and solvency that's adequate so that you remain viable. So we're talking about four ideas which are in conflict with each other. So we're trying to maintain viability and trying to remain profitability. And we're trying to maintain liquidity, and we're trying to maintain solvency. And these things are often in opposition. I can improve liquidity by borrowing money long term. So I'm going to borrow money that I don't have to pay back for 5 years. That money becomes a current asset, so it improves my liquidity, but it actually hurts my long-term solvency because I have to pay that back 5 years from now. So there's a trade-off between liquidity and solvency. Profitability and viability, I can be very profitable if I take a lot of risks, but that may affect my viability. So if I choose to be risk-oriented, I can be less than viable. If I choose to be viability-oriented, what does that do? So should I maximize my viability? I don't know. Should I maximize my viability? Seems like a good idea. Maximize viability, I'm going to survive. Well, what's the best viability option? What's the absolute best viability option? If I have $50 million in cash and I have no liabilities and I just keep everything in cash, I am very viable. I'm not going away. I've got $50 million and I don't spend it. Great. Do I make any money? No, I'm totally not profitable because I've got the $50 million in a big safe in my office, and I don't touch it, so I'm very viable, but I don't have any operations, so I'm not very profitable. So if I maximize viability, I may impair my profitability. If I maximize my profitability, I may impair my viability. So I'm always trying to do both, trying to find that magic golden mean where I'm both viable and profitable as I can be while remaining viable as I can be while remaining profitable. So kind of a tough thing. There's always a trade-off, and it's difficult, and that's what finance people get paid to do. That's what those bean counters in the corner are really trying to do. They're trying to be both viable and profitable at the same time and not go too far off the deep end on either one of those things. Now, we know companies do go off the deep end. Those of you who are involved in aspects of the maritime oil industry know that many companies have gone off the deep end because they were trying to maximize profit and didn't take enough risk prevention methods to prevent their viability being threatened. So profitability and viability are not synonymous. You can be profitable every year of your existence and yet fail. It happens with fast-growing companies often. It's because of poor financial planning. So a fast-growing company needs to do all sorts of things. They have to acquire inventory, and the faster they grow, the more inventory they have to acquire. If they're a manufacturer, they may have to acquire more plants to build enough inventory. They have to acquire equipment for those plants. They have to finance their customers' receivables. They're selling things and waiting to get paid, so they have to provide funds to finance receivables, and they have to hire people. So all of those things happen before they get revenue. So we have to do all these things. And the faster we grow, the more things we have to do before we're going to get more revenue, but we have to wait for the revenue. So all of these things have to happen. So we're reporting profits. When we make a sale, we report the revenue, but that doesn't mean we've got the cash yet. When we buy inventory, we spend money on inventory and it becomes an asset. So it's not an expense. It's a swapping of cash for an asset that sits in inventory and then has to be, doesn't become an expense until we sell it. When we buy a plant, it has a long life, or a warehouse or whatever, or equipment. Those things have long lives. So we spend the money on them. They aren't expenses. A portion of them each year is expensed as part of depreciation, but the whole asset is going to last 10 years. So we're going to spread the asset cost over 10 years. So we don't expense them all, but we have to put all the cash out. So we eat cash to grow, and that can kill us if we can't meet those needs. So these outlays have to be made before we receive revenue. We have to plan for liquidity and solvency as well as growth. And the mistake that a lot of young, fast-growing companies make is they don't plan for liquidity and solvency. They just are focused on growth. And unless you've got very patient investors and very patient lenders, that can be a real problem. Now, some companies do succeed at that. Two big ones, one currently and one in the not too distant past. Amazon, for years, had negative cash flow, but they had patient investors and patient lenders. So Jeff Bezos was a master at convincing his investors and lenders to hang in there, keep giving me money, and eventually you'll get it back. And he's made good on that promise, but for the first 7 or 8 years of Amazon's existence, they just burned cash. They didn't make any money. They may have reported profits, but they had no cash. They needed to constantly borrow. And right now, Tesla is doing the same thing. Elon Musk is also a very good person at raising funds from investors. So he has convinced investors that his future is great. We're growing like Topsy, but we need lots of cash to continue to grow. And in Musk's case, it's billions and billions of dollars that he needs to grow. And the company is not generating those. They're coming from outside. So cash flow projections is one way to look at this, and you'll learn how to do simple cash flow projections, but they're the same kind of cash flow projections that any company does. So you'll learn the process and methods for doing so. So remember, profitability doesn't guarantee survival, and survival doesn't guarantee profitability, and really balancing these things is what financial management is all about. So a few short questions after this lecture, and don't forget you have a case study to do for Baron Castine, and good luck with that. And remember, on that case study, I'm looking for the best you can do. I know that many of you don't have financial backgrounds, so you're not going to be able to give me a well-formed or perfectly formatted balance sheet and income statement. I want to see you try, and you're not going to lose points for not doing it per form. I want to see the effort, because what I'm really looking for you here is to start understanding why this stuff is important. Not necessarily how to do it. I haven't taught you how to do it, but see if you can figure out why it's important. In addition, in that case, you have to figure out what currencies are all about, because there are no dollars or yen or euros in that case. You have to figure out how currencies work. In the case you're in a barter economy, so you're using a currency of a commodity instead of a currency of a dollar or a yen. So good luck with that, and I'll talk to you later.